Everyone remembers their first day at a new job. Most people worry about making a good impression. I was worried about something completely different. Because less than 10 minutes after meeting my new CEO, I saw a framed photograph sitting on his desk. And the woman smiling in that picture was my wife. When I finally asked him who she was, he smiled proudly and said, "That's my daughter." My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 37 years old, and until that moment, I believed my marriage was built on honesty. After losing my previous job, I accepted a management position at Harrison Logistics in Denver, hoping for a fresh start. Instead, I walked straight into the biggest mystery of my life. Richard Harrison welcomed me warmly and began introducing me to the company. I tried to focus. I really did. But my eyes kept drifting back to that photograph. The same green eyes, the same warm smile, even the tiny scar above her left eyebrow. It wasn't someone who looked like my wife. It was my wife. Trying to stay calm, I pointed at the frame. "Who's that?" Richard smiled. "My daughter? Emily? Emily? No, my wife's name was Claire. At least, that's what I'd believed for the last 9 years. I somehow finished my first day at work. But on the drive home, I made one decision. Tonight, I was finally going to ask my wife a question she'd never seen coming, and her reaction would tell me everything. The drive home was torture. I kept telling myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe Richard's daughter simply looked like Claire. Maybe I was letting stress get the best of me. But deep down, I already knew this wasn't a coincidence. The front door opened before I reached it. "There you are," Claire said with her usual smile, wrapping her arms around me. "So, how was your first day?" I hugged her back. But this time, it felt different. For the first time in 9 years, I wasn't looking at my wife. I was looking for answers. Over dinner, I acted like everything was normal. We talked about work, the kids, weekend plans. Then I casually said, "My CEO showed me some family pictures today." She looked up. "Oh, he has a daughter." She nodded slowly. "What was her name?" The question came so quickly that it caught me off guard. I held her gaze. "Emily." For a split second, the color drained from her face. Her hand loosened. The glass she was holding slipped onto the table, spilling water everywhere. She forced a nervous laugh. "I guess I'm more tired than I thought. Maybe." Or maybe she'd just heard the one name she'd hoped never to hear again. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I felt Claire quietly climb out of bed. She thought I was asleep. A few moments later, I heard the back door close. I looked out the bedroom window. She was standing alone in the backyard, holding her phone to her ear. The only words I could make out were, "He knows." Then, "I don't have much time." My heart started pounding. Who was she talking to? And what exactly did she think I knew? Before I could get any closer, she turned around. For a brief second, our eyes met through the kitchen window. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. But in that silent moment, I realized something terrifying. My wife wasn't hiding one secret. She was hiding an entire life. The next morning, my phone buzzed. It was Richard Harrison. His message was short. "Lunch today? There's something personal I'd like to share with you." I had no idea. His story was about to connect every piece of the puzzle. The next afternoon, I met Richard at a quiet diner just a few blocks from the office. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect a millionaire CEO to choose. "No cameras," he joked. "The food's better here anyway." For a while, we talked about business, new projects, company goals. Nothing unusual. Then his smile slowly disappeared. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an old leather wallet. From inside, he carefully removed a faded photograph. A little girl. She couldn't have been older than 5. "My daughter," he said quietly. "Emily." I looked down at the picture. Even as a child, there was something painfully familiar about her. Richard took a deep breath. My ex-wife left after our divorce. One morning, they were simply gone. No note, no phone call, no address. I searched everywhere. I hired private investigators. I checked school records. I even followed false leads across 3 different states. But every trail ended the same way. Nothing. His voice cracked for the first time. "You know what hurts the most? It wasn't missing birthdays. It was wondering if she believed I stopped looking. I didn't know what to say. Richard opened a small folder and slid one final picture across the table. This was created by investigators a few years ago. It shows what Emily might look like today. The moment I saw it, my stomach dropped. It wasn't just similar to Claire. It was Claire. Same eyes, same smile, same scar above her eyebrow. There was no room left for doubt. Richard looked at me and smiled sadly. I still believe she's alive. And if I ever get one more chance, I'd tell her I never gave up. His words hit me like a freight train. Because at that exact moment, his daughter wasn't missing anymore. She was sitting at my kitchen table every single night. Driving home, I gripped the steering wheel tighter than ever before. No more theories. No more excuses. Tonight, Claire was finally going to tell me the truth. When I walked through my front door that evening, Claire was already waiting for me. But before I could ask a single question, she looked me straight in the eyes and said, "We need to talk." Somehow, she already knew I'd discovered her secret. The moment I stepped inside the house, I knew something was different. Claire was sitting alone at the dining table. The TV was off, the lights were dim, and for the first time since we'd met, she looked genuinely terrified. "We need to talk," she said quietly. I didn't answer. Instead, I reached into my briefcase and placed 2 photographs on the table, the childhood picture Richard had shown me, and the age-progressed image. Claire stared at them. The color drained from her face. Her lips trembled. For nearly 20 seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I broke the silence. "Who are you?" She closed her eyes. Then came the words that changed everything. "My name isn't Claire. It's Emily." I felt like the air had been pulled out of the room. "I've lied to everyone for years, but I never wanted to lie to you." I looked at her in disbelief. "Then why did you?" She wiped away a tear. "When I was 5, my mother told me my father abandoned us. She said he loved his company more than his family. She changed our names, moved us across different states, and made sure he could never find us. I grew up believing he never wanted me." Her voice cracked. "So when did you learn the truth?" She looked down. 6 years ago." I froze. 6 years? She nodded. "After my mother passed away, I found old court documents in a storage box. There were custody papers, letters, returned birthday cards. I realized my father had been searching for me the entire time. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You knew he was innocent, and you still never told me?" Tears streamed down her face. "I wanted to. So many times. But every year I waited, it became harder. I was ashamed. I hated him for something he never did. And then I lied to the person I loved most. For the first time that night, I stopped seeing a woman who had deceived me. I saw a little girl who had spent her entire childhood believing she had been abandoned. I sat down across from her. Neither of us spoke. Sometimes, silence says more than words ever can. Then she whispered something I never expected. I've driven past Richard's office dozens of times. I looked up. What? I'd park across the street. I wanted to walk inside. I wanted to tell him I was his daughter. But every time, I got scared. What if he didn't want me anymore? I slowly reached across the table and held her trembling hand. "You know what Richard told me today?" She shook her head. "He said, if I ever get one more chance, I'd tell my daughter I never stopped looking for her." Emily completely broke down. Years of guilt, fear, and regret came pouring out at once. I squeezed her hand. "Then let's stop wondering. Let's give him that chance." She looked at me through tears. "You'd really go with me?" I smiled. "You don't have to do this alone." For the first time all night, she smiled back. A small smile. But it was enough. She had finally decided to face the past. Neither of us realized. The reunion would happen much sooner than we expected. The very next morning, Richard called my office. His invitation sounded ordinary. "Ethan, why don't you and your wife come over for dinner tomorrow?" He had no idea. He had just invited the daughter he'd been searching for over the last 30 years. The next evening, neither of us said much during the drive. Emily stared out the window, twisting her wedding ring over and over. "What if he hates me?" she whispered. I looked at her and smiled. A man who spent 30 years searching for his daughter doesn't suddenly stop loving her. She nodded, but I could still see the fear in her eyes. Not the fear of rejection, the fear of discovering she'd lost 30 years for nothing. We pulled into Richard's driveway just before sunset. The porch light was already on. He opened the door with a warm smile. "Ethan, come on in!" Then he looked at Emily. His smile disappeared. He stared at her for several long seconds, almost as if his heart recognized someone his mind couldn't believe was standing there. He took one slow step forward. His voice barely escaped his lips. "Emily?" She couldn't hold back anymore. Tears streamed down her face. "Dad." Richard covered his mouth with one trembling hand. "No," he whispered. "My little girl." Before another word could be spoken, he wrapped his arms around her. Neither of them cared who was watching. They simply cried. 30 years of unanswered questions. 30 years of birthdays. 30 years of missed hugs. All disappeared in one unforgettable embrace. I quietly stepped back. Some moments are too important to interrupt. After several minutes, Richard finally smiled through his tears. I've imagined this day thousands of times. But somehow, it still wasn't as beautiful as I dreamed. Emily could barely speak. "I'm sorry. I believed things that weren't true. I should have found you sooner." Richard gently held her face. "Listen to me. You were 5 years old. You trusted the only parent you had. You have nothing to apologize for. The adults failed you. You never failed me." Emily broke down again. For the first time in decades, the guilt she'd been carrying finally began to disappear. Later that evening, Richard disappeared into another room. When he returned, he carried an old cardboard box. "I've been saving these." Inside were dozens of unopened birthday presents, Christmas cards, letters, every single one addressed to Emily. I mailed something every birthday. Every Christmas. I never stopped hoping one day you'd read them. Emily opened one of the letters with shaking hands. Inside was a simple message. "No matter where you are, I'll never stop looking for you." She hugged Richard again. Neither of them needed any more words. Everything that mattered had already been said. As we were leaving, Richard stopped me at the front door. "Ethan, I can never repay what you've done." I shook my head. "I didn't reunite your family. I just asked one question." Richard smiled. "And sometimes, one honest question can change an entire lifetime." 3 weeks later, Richard called me back to his office. I thought it was another routine meeting. Instead, he placed a folder on his desk. And what was inside would change my life forever. 3 weeks passed. Life finally felt peaceful. Emily and Richard spoke almost every day. Sometimes for 5 minutes. Sometimes for hours. They weren't trying to make up for 30 lost years. They were simply making the most of the time they still had. One Monday morning, my assistant walked into my office. "Mr. Harrison would like to see you." I grabbed my notebook, expecting another strategy meeting. Instead, Richard was standing by the window with a folder in his hands. He turned and smiled. "Close the door, Ethan." Something about his voice felt different. I sat down. He placed the folder in front of me. "I've spent the last few weeks watching how you work." I looked confused. "You've earned the respect of every department manager. You solve problems without creating new ones, and you lead people instead of managing them." I smiled. "I'm just doing the job you hired me to do," Richard nodded. "Exactly." Then he pushed the folder toward me. "I'd like you to become our new executive director of operations." For a moment, I honestly thought he was joking. This is a huge promotion. "People are going to say it's because I'm your son-in-law." Richard laughed. "They're free to believe whatever they want." Then he looked me straight in the eyes. "But I knew your character, long before I knew you were family. Those words meant more to me than the promotion itself." I accepted. Not because of the title, not because of the salary, but because I'd earned the trust of a man I deeply respected. Months passed. Sunday dinners became a tradition. Richard never missed one. Our kids finally had the grandfather they'd always deserved. And Emily, for the first time since I'd met her, she looked completely at peace. One Sunday afternoon, my youngest son looked at Richard and asked, Grandpa, were you really looking for Mommy all those years? Richard smiled. He gently pulled him onto his lap. Every single day, and I'd do it all over again if it meant finding her. Emily quietly wiped away a tear, not because she was sad, but because she finally understood what unconditional love looked like. A few days later, I walked into Richard's office for another meeting. The silver picture frame was still sitting in the exact same spot, but something had changed. The old photograph was gone. Now, it held a brand new family picture. Richard, Emily, our 2 kids, and me. I couldn't help but smile. A few months earlier, that same frame had almost destroyed my marriage. Now, it represented the family we never knew we were missing. Life has a strange way of revealing the truth. Sometimes, the answers you fear the most become the greatest blessing of your life. And all because one ordinary question led to an extraordinary miracle. Who's that woman? If I had never asked those 4 words, a father might have spent the rest of his life searching. A daughter might have carried guilt forever, and our children would have grown up without knowing the grandfather who loved them long before they were even born. Sometimes the truth doesn't tear a family apart. Sometimes it finally brings them home. If this story touched your heart, let me know in the comments. What would you have done if you were in Ethan's place? And if you enjoy emotional stories with powerful twists and unforgettable endings, subscribe and join us for the next story. Because the next question may change someone's life all over again.